The alarm in my chest cavity started the moment I heard the words, "Human delegation has docked at Port 7. I had been watching the Nathari run their blade dance drill from the observation gallery, all four arms spinning polished steel in patterns that would have carved any lesser species into pieces. Beautiful work, I had to admit. Fast, precise, deadly. But I had seen this exact routine 6 times across 3 conclaves, and I knew every gap in their rotation down to the fraction of a heartbeat. I am the supreme champion of the Caliph Dominion. I have held that title for 214 sanctioned bouts across 9 decades. My claws have touched the throats of every ranked fighter in known space. My species has ruled the combat rankings for 900 years, longer than most civilizations in this station have had spaceflight. I am not boasting. Curiosity mixed with a whisper of warning. Humans, Thelis said beside me, his scales rippling with amusement. He was my second in command. A fine warrior, loyal to the bone. He was also deeply predictable in his opinions. They actually came. I was certain they would find an excuse. I said nothing. I kept my eyes on the main docking corridor below us, visible through the reinforced viewing panel. Around me, representatives from 11 other species were doing the same, all of them leaning forward, all of them wearing some version of the same expression: amusement, dismissal. The kind of look you give a small creature that has wandered into the wrong territory. Every 10 years, the greatest warrior species in known space gathered here for the decennial combat conclave. We watched each other train. We studied each other's techniques. We sparred in exhibition matches. And at the end, one species was crowned the supreme combat force in the galaxy. For the last 90 conclaves, that species had been mine. The invitation to humanity had been controversial. Most of the council had voted against it. Humans were a young species, barely a century into interstellar travel, with no significant military reputation. They had no natural weapons, no claws, no venom glands, no armored plates, no psychic abilities. Their skin was soft, their bones broke easily. They were, by every measurable standard, one of the most physically unremarkable species in the catalogued galaxy. But then came the incident at the Drenari border. A single human squad, 12 soldiers, had been caught in a choke point during a Drenari raid on a contested colony. Standard military wisdom said they should have fallen in under an hour. The Drenari were fast, heavily armed, and outnumbered the humans 4-1. Instead, those 12 humans held that choke point for 41 hours. They rotated positions, improvised barriers from wreckage, treated their own wounds between engagements, and kept fighting long past the point where any reasonable analysis said they should have been finished. When reinforcements finally arrived, 9 of the 12 were still standing. The Drenari had pulled back. I had read the intelligence report 3 times. Each time, I found a new detail that did not fit my existing models. The humans had not used superior technology. Their weapons were standard. Their armor was basic. They had won through something else. Something the report kept calling adaptability and sustained aggression under degrading conditions. I had dismissed this as a polite way of saying they were desperate and lucky. Now they were here, and I was about to find out if I was right. The airlock cycled open. The human delegation walked through in a neat column, 30 of them in matching gray uniforms. They were small. The tallest among them might have reached my chest. Their bodies were covered in fabric, making it hard to assess their physical condition. But I could see enough. Narrow shoulders on some, broader on others. No uniform body type, which was strange. Kalith warriors were bred for combat. Gorvan were born massive. Nathari hatched with blade arms. These humans looked like they had been assembled from spare parts, each one slightly different from the next, as if their species had not decided what shape it wanted to be. At the front of the column walked a compact woman with short dark hair and a scar that ran from her left temple down to her jaw. She moved with an economy that I recognized, the way someone moves when they have learned that wasted motion gets you hurt. Her eyes were scanning constantly, flicking left, right, up, checking corners and exits and distances. Not the nervous scanning of prey. This was tactical awareness, the kind that gets trained into you until it becomes as automatic as breathing. Commander Lucy Grant, Thelis read from his datapad, commanding officer of the human delegation, 14 years of active service, 6 combat deployments. She is small, the Gorvan delegate rumbled from behind us. His name was Druk, and he was enormous, even by Gorvan standards. A walking fortress of muscle and bone plate standing nearly 10 feet tall. His voice sounded like grinding stone. All of them are small. This is what the council wastes our time with. Several delegates chuckled. The Nathari clicked their mandibles in what passed for laughter among their kind. Even Thelis allowed himself a low hiss of amusement. I did not laugh. I was watching the human commander's eyes. She had looked up at the gallery the moment she entered. One quick sweep, lasting no more than 2 seconds. In that time, her gaze had touched every face in the room, catalogued every species, and moved on. There was no awe in her expression, no nervousness, no defiance either. She looked at a gallery full of the most dangerous warriors in the galaxy, the same way you might look at a room full of furniture. The human delegation was assigned quarters in the lower ring, a section normally reserved for support staff and observers, not competing delegations. It was a deliberate slight. Commander Grant accepted the assignment without comment, thanked the station liaison, and led her people away in that same neat column. They did not even protest, Thelis said, confused. He was right to be confused. At the conclave, everything was a statement. Where you were housed said something about your standing. The Gorvon had demanded the largest quarters and refused to enter until the doorways were widened. The Nathari had insisted on specific humidity controls. The Silith had required an entire deck to themselves, claiming that proximity to other mines disrupted their concentration. Every species had made demands upon arrival because demands demonstrated power. The humans had made none. They do not understand the protocols, Druck said dismissively. Animals in a museum, touching things they should not touch. The humans acted like species who had more important things to worry about than where they slept. Privacy was a concept that had been abandoned here centuries ago. What I saw was unremarkable and somehow unsettling at the same time. The humans unpacked efficiently, stowed their gear, and set up their quarters with military precision. Nothing unexpected there. But then, barely an hour after arrival, they began exercising. Not formal training. Nothing structured. Soldiers dropped to the floor of their quarters and did rapid push-ups in between unpacking equipment. Two of them jogged laps in the corridor outside their rooms, dodging around confused alien maintenance staff. A muscular man with close-cropped blonde hair did pull-ups from a support beam in the hallway ceiling, while carrying on a casual conversation with the woman spotting him below. They were laughing, trading jokes, pushing each other. One soldier threw a bundled uniform at another, who dodged it and responded with a quick jab to the shoulder. The jab landed with a sharp crack that would have broken bone in most species. The recipient barely flinched, grinned, and jabbed back. They treated physical contact the same way other species treated conversation. Casual, constant, woven into every interaction. A slap on the back. A shove. A mock wrestling hold that lasted 3 seconds before dissolving into laughter. They touched violence the way you might touch water, stepping in and out of it without ceremony. They play like younglings, Thelis said, watching the feed over my shoulder. No, I said quietly. Younglings play to learn. These ones already know. They play to stay sharp. Thelis gave me a strange look but said nothing. The next morning, the Conclave Master gathered all delegations in the central amphitheater for the opening ceremony. The Conclave Master was a Pelori, one of the ancient administrative species that governed neutral spaces like the Crucible. He was frail, translucent-skinned, and had never held a weapon in his life. But he commanded the respect of every warrior in the room because he controlled the schedule, the rules, and the rankings. Cross the Conclave Master, and your species could find itself uninvited for the next century. Welcome to the 412th Decennial Combat Conclave, he announced, his voice amplified through the chamber. As tradition demands, each delegation will demonstrate their training regimen before the assembled gallery. The order of demonstration will be determined by standing. The Gorvon will go first, the Nethari second, the Silith third, the Kalith fourth. He paused and looked at the human delegation with an expression that was carefully neutral. The human delegation, as first-time attendees, will demonstrate last, unless they wish to request an earlier position. Every eye in the room turned to Commander Grant. This was another test. Requesting an earlier slot would show eagerness, a desire to prove themselves. Accepting the last position would show submission, an acknowledgement of their low status. Grant stood up. She was shorter than every other delegation leader in the room, and she did not seem to care even slightly. Last works fine for us, she said. We would like to watch everyone else first, if that is all right. Druck let out a rumbling laugh. The prey wants to learn from its betters before it embarrasses itself. How thoughtful. It was a small smile, barely there, the kind you might miss if you were not looking directly at her. But I was looking, and I saw it clearly, and it made the warning whisper in my chest grow louder. It was not a nervous smile. It was not a polite smile. It was the smile of someone who has already won an argument that no one else knows is happening. I had seen that smile before, on the faces of opponents who knew something I did not. It never meant anything good. I leaned back in my seat and folded my claws together. Around me, the galaxy's mightiest fighters were laughing at humanity. The Gorvan were already placing wagers on how quickly the human demonstration would turn into a humiliation. The Nathari were debating whether the humans would even last 5 minutes. The Silith sat in their sealed section, projecting quiet contempt. And through it all, Commander Lucy Grant sat with her hands folded in her lap and that small, patient smile on her face. She looked like someone who had taken a seat at a table full of card players and already knew what everyone was holding. I did not laugh with the others. Instead, I made a note in my personal file, the private record I had kept for 200 years, of every opponent I had studied, every fight I had planned, every instinct that had kept me alive. The note read simply, "Watch them. Watch everything they do." I did not know it then, but that one decision, that single moment of paying attention when everyone else was laughing, would save more than just my pride. It would change the way I understood fighting, strength, and what it truly meant to be a warrior. First, I had to watch my world fall apart. The Gorvan went first, as tradition demanded. Their training arena took up the entire eastern wing of the Crucible, a cavernous space reinforced with triple-layered hull plating, because standard walls could not survive what the Gorvan did to them. I stood in the observation gallery with the other delegation leaders, looking down through shielded glass at a scene that would have terrified most species in the galaxy. 50 Gorvan warriors stood in formation below us. Each one was a wall of dense muscle wrapped in natural bone armor, the plates on their shoulders and spines thick enough to deflect standard ballistic rounds. Their training began with what they called foundation work. A Gorvan soldier walked to a stack of starship hull plating, each sheet weighing more than most humanoid species, and began folding the sheets with his bare hands. Not cutting, not breaking, folding, the way you might fold a piece of paper. The metal screamed and bent, and the Gorvan did not even grunt with effort. Around me, several delegates murmured in appreciation. The Nathari delegation leader tilted her head, tracking the movement with compound eyes. The Silith watched through half-closed lids, their tentacles curled in studied boredom. I watched the humans. They were seated in the far corner of the gallery, all 30 of them in their plain gray uniforms. Commander Grant sat at the front with a datapad balanced on her knee. Behind her, the others watched the Gorvan demonstration with calm attention. Some of them were taking notes. One soldier, the muscular blond man I had noticed earlier, leaned over to another and whispered something. The other soldier shook his head slightly and whispered back. Neither of them looked impressed or frightened. They looked like students in a classroom, absorbing information with professional detachment. The Gorvan demonstration continued. After the foundation work came endurance marching. The 50 warriors loaded themselves with equipment packs weighing twice their body mass and marched in formation for 3 hours without pause. The floor shook with every synchronized step. The sound was thunderous, a deep rhythmic pounding that you felt in your chest rather than heard with your ears. Then came the pain conditioning. This was the part that made other species uncomfortable. Gorvon warriors stood in rows while their senior trainers struck them with heavy metal rods across the shoulders, chest, and back. The impacts cracked through the air like gunfire. The warriors being struck did not move, did not flinch, did not make any sound. This was the Gorvon philosophy reduced to its purest form. Pain was inevitable. Therefore, you trained your body to disregard it entirely. The strong survived. The weak were removed from service. Druk stood at the edge of the gallery, his massive arms crossed, watching his warriors with obvious pride. He caught me looking, and bared his teeth in what the Gorvon considered a friendly smile. 900 years of your Kalith tricks, he rumbled, and you have never produced a warrior who can break hull plating with his bare hands. We have never needed to, I replied. He snorted, because you have never fought a Gorvon who wanted to end you. I did not bother responding. Druk and I had fought twice in exhibition bouts. I had won both times in under 4 minutes. Strength without precision was just noise. The expression on her face had not changed once during the entire 3-hour demonstration. The Nathari went second. Their demonstration was the opposite of the Gorvon display in every way. Where the Gorvon were massive and direct, the Nathari were sleek and intricate. They were an insectoid species, tall and slender, with 4 arms that each ended in 3-fingered hands, capable of holding weapons with surgical precision. Their exoskeletons were the color of dark copper, segmented and flexible, allowing a range of motion that most bipedal species could not match. The blade dance was their signature. 60 Nathari warriors took the floor in pairs, each one wielding 4 short curved swords, one in each hand. Music played through the arena speakers, a high-pitched clicking rhythm that matched the natural communication sounds of the Nathari language, and the warriors began to move. It was, I will admit, beautiful. The swords carved through the air in interlocking patterns, each blade following a precise mathematical arc that brought it within a fraction of an inch of the partner, without making contact. The speed increased gradually until the blades were moving faster than most eyes could track, silver blurs that sang as they cut the air. Then combat drones were released into the arena, small armored spheres that darted and weaved unpredictably, and the Nathari cut them down without breaking the rhythm of their dance. 6 drones per warrior, 240 simultaneously. Not a single drone survived more than 8 seconds. The gallery applauded, which is to say that each species made whatever gesture passed for approval in their culture. The Gorvon pounded their fists on the railing. The Silith pulsed a faint glow from their cranial membranes. I inclined my head once, the Kalith acknowledgement of worthy skill. The humans did nothing. They just watched. One of them, a woman with red hair pulled back in a tight knot, was sketching something on a datapad, not writing notes, drawing. She was mapping the blade dance patterns, I realized with a start. She was charting the geometry of the Nathari sword arcs the way an engineer might chart the stress points in a structural beam. The Silith went next, and the mood in the gallery shifted. Nobody liked the Silith. They were a cephalopod species, 8-limbed, with large bulbous heads and skin that changed color with their emotional state. They communicated primarily through telepathy, which meant that being near a Silith felt like having someone press their face against the window of your mind and peer inside. They could not read complex thoughts without significant effort and willing participation, but they could sense emotions with effortless precision. Fear, anger, confidence, doubt. A Silith in the room knew exactly what you were feeling, and that knowledge alone was a weapon. Their combat demonstration was not physical, it was psychological. Two Silith warriors faced each other across the arena floor, and without any visible movement, one of them collapsed to the ground, limbs curling inward, skin flashing bright distress patterns. The attacking Silith had projected pure concentrated fear directly into the other's nervous system, overriding conscious control and triggering a complete shutdown response. A particularly unsettling exercise where a Silith warrior forced 3 combat drones to fly into the arena walls by psychically interfering with their navigation systems. The message was clear. The Silith did not need to touch you to end you. They could reach inside your mind and flip the switch that kept you functional. The gallery was quiet during the Silith demonstration, and not in admiration. The Gorvon shifted their weight uncomfortably. The Nathari kept their compound eyes fixed forward with rigid discipline. Even I felt the familiar prickle of discomfort that came from being in a room with active telepaths. I looked at the humans again, expecting to see the same discomfort. What I saw instead stopped me cold. Commander Grant was leaning forward in her seat, elbows on her knees, chin resting on her folded hands. She was watching the Silith demonstration with the most intense focus I had seen from her since she arrived. Not fear, not discomfort, focus. The same kind of focus I had seen in her eyes when she scanned the docking corridor. She was studying the Silith, the way a locksmith studies a lock, looking for the mechanism, the structure, the point where pressure could be applied. The soldier next to her, a tall man with dark skin and calm eyes, whose name tag read Webb, leaned close and said something too quiet for me to catch. Grant nodded once without taking her eyes off the arena. I made another note in my private file. Then it was our turn. I led my warriors onto the arena floor personally, 40 of the finest fighters in the Dominion, each one bred and trained from hatching for the sole purpose of combat excellence. The arena was divided into 4 zones, and my warriors fought simultaneously in all of them. One quarter was flooded with water, another was depressurized to simulate vacuum conditions. A third was heated to temperatures that would have blistered human skin on contact. The fourth was left at standard conditions for baseline comparison. My warriors fought with equal efficiency in all 4, their movements precise, economical, and devastating. Then came weapons mastery. Each warrior cycled through 7 weapon types in rapid succession, demonstrating proficiency with blades, staves, projectile weapons, energy weapons, improvised weapons, restraint tools, and bear claw combat. The transitions were seamless. A warrior finished a blade sequence, discarded the weapon, caught a staff thrown by a partner, completed a staff form, and moved to the next weapon without a single wasted heartbeat. Finally, I demonstrated the silence. This was the crown of Kalith combat philosophy. The silence was a meditative state in which all emotion was purged from the mind, leaving behind nothing but function, not thought, not feeling, pure combat awareness, stripped of fear, anger, hesitation, ego, and doubt. In the silence, a Kalith warrior became a perfect instrument, as precise and dispassionate as a mathematical equation. I faced 3 of my own elite guards, the best fighters in my delegation after myself. They attacked simultaneously, with full contact intensity. I fought them blindfolded. The bout lasted 90 seconds. All 3 guards were on the ground at the end. I had not taken a single clean hit. The gallery erupted. Even the Gorvon pounded the railing in grudging respect. Druck caught my eye and gave me a slow nod, the closest thing to admiration that proud species could manage. The Nethari delegation leader dipped her antennae in formal acknowledgement. The Silith said nothing, as usual, but their skin patterns shifted to the muted blues that indicated they were reassessing something. I removed my blindfold and looked up at the gallery. The humans were still seated in their corner. Grant had stopped writing on her datapad. She was looking directly at me. Those were the reactions I had seen on the faces of new species at every conclave for 2 centuries. Grant's expression held none of them. She looked at me the way a chess player looks at the board after the opponent has made a strong move. Respectful, attentive, already thinking 3 moves ahead. After the formal demonstrations ended, the delegations mingled in the common areas, which was really just a polite word for the informal intelligence gathering that happened at every conclave. Warriors studied each other up close, tested boundaries, probed for weaknesses through casual conversation. I found Commander Grant standing alone near one of the viewing ports, looking out at the dead star the Crucible orbited. The dying light painted her face in shades of deep orange and red. She was shorter than I expected up close, the top of her head barely reaching the middle of my chest. Her scar caught the starlight. "Commander," I said, "I hope the demonstrations were informative." She turned to face me. Up close, I could see fine lines around her eyes, the kind that came from years of squinting into harsh light. "Supreme Champion," she said. "They were. Your demonstration in particular was extraordinary." I waited for the qualifier. In my experience, when a warrior called your performance extraordinary, the next word was usually but. "Every delegation here is exceptional at what they do," she continued. "The Gorvan, the Nathari, your warriors. All of them." She looked at me for a long moment. Her eyes were dark brown, and they held a quality I could not immediately name. Not confidence exactly. Something quieter, something patient. "That is a very good question," she said. Then she excused herself and walked back to her delegation. I stood by the viewing port for some time after she left, watching the dead star and thinking about her words. They train to be the best version of what they already are. I went to my quarters and tried to meditate. The silence would not come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Grant's face, and that small patient smile, and I heard her careful phrasing, and I wondered what kind of warrior trains to be something other than the best version of themselves. I did not sleep that night. In 200 years of conclaves, that had never happened before. Tomorrow was the human demonstration. Every other species had already dismissed it as a formality, the obligatory embarrassment of a new delegation that would be forgotten by the next conclave. The Gorvan were still taking bets. The Nathari had already filed their assessment. Humans posed no competitive threat. The observation gallery was full for the first time in recorded conclave history. I had attended 9 of these gatherings over my career, and never once had every seat been occupied for a demonstration. There were always empty spaces, delegations that skipped a session because they had already assessed a species and found it beneath their attention. But today, every seat was taken. Every railing was lined with bodies. The Gorvan had brought extra warriors from their quarters to watch. The Nathari had requested additional gallery space. Even the Silith had opened their sealed section and were observing from behind their environmental screens. Nobody wanted to miss the humans failing. The most popular bet was that the human demonstration would last less than 30 minutes before devolving into something the gallery would find either boring or comical. Second most popular was that at least one human would injure themselves with their own equipment. Druck had bet on both. I took my seat in the front row, Thelis beside me. He had his datapad ready for notes, though his expression suggested he expected to write very little. The arena floor below us had been cleared and reconfigured to human specifications. Their setup was sparse: a flat open area for calisthenics, a padded section for sparring, a simulated structure built from modular panels for tactical exercises, and a row of equipment racks holding items I did not immediately recognize. Nothing about the layout was impressive, compared to the environmental zones of the Kalith demonstration, or the mathematical precision of the Nathari blade dance arena. The human setup looked almost primitive. Commander Grant walked onto the arena floor, followed by her 30 soldiers. They formed up in loose rows, not the rigid formations the other species favored, but something more casual, comfortable, with enough space between each soldier for free movement. Grant stepped to the front, looked up at the packed gallery, and spoke. "Good morning. What you are about to observe is a condensed version of standard human combat readiness training. We will cover 4 phases: physical conditioning, combat drilling, stress adaptation, and applied tactics. Each phase builds on the one before it." She paused. "We appreciate your attention. No bravado. No posturing. No promises of greatness. She might as well have been introducing a lecture on soil composition. Running. The 30 humans began jogging around the perimeter of the arena in a loose group, their pace steady and unremarkable. The gallery settled in for what it expected to be a brief and disappointing show. Then the pace increased. The jog became a run. The run became a sprint. The humans sprinted for 2 full minutes, then dropped to the ground simultaneously and began doing push-ups. Not slow, measured push-ups. Rapid, explosive repetitions that launched their upper bodies off the floor with each cycle. After 50, they jumped back to their feet and sprinted again. Then they stopped and did a different exercise, something called burpees, I learned later, a combination of a squat, a push-up, and a vertical jump, performed in one continuous motion. They did 40 of them without pause, each one explosive, each one performed with the same intensity as the first. Then they sprinted again. The cycle continued. Sprint, exercise, sprint, different exercise, sprint. The exercises changed every round, targeting different muscle groups, different energy systems, different physical capacities. This was not random. This was systematic. They were methodically pushing every system in their bodies to its limit, recovering just enough to push again, and cycling through variations, so that no single system could adapt and grow comfortable. He staggered to the edge of the running path, bent over, emptied his stomach, wiped his mouth, and rejoined the group without missing the next sprint. Their uniforms were soaked through with sweat, their faces flushed deep red, and their breathing was ragged and desperate. One of the soldiers, the tall man I had identified as Sergeant Webb, finished a set of pull-ups on a portable bar, and immediately began another set, with a fellow soldier clinging to his back, arms locked around his shoulders. The added weight was enormous. His muscles shook visibly. Veins stood out on his neck and forehead like cables under his skin, and while he did the pull-ups, while his body was under maximum load, he began reciting. It was tactical protocol, grid coordinates, communication frequencies, engagement rules, medical procedures. He spoke in a steady, measured cadence that never wavered, despite the fact that his body was under such extreme physical stress that his arms were trembling with every repetition. He was not just training his body to be strong, he was training his mind to function, while his body was being pushed beyond its limits. I looked at Thelis. His datapad was forgotten in his lap. His mouth was slightly open. I looked at the Gorvan section. Druck had stopped smiling. His massive hands were gripping the gallery railing, and the metal was bending under his fingers. Grant called out a command, and the first phase ended. The soldiers stopped, stood in formation, and breathed. Their recovery was remarkably fast. Within 2 minutes, heart rates had dropped, breathing had steadied, and the flush of exhaustion had begun to fade from their faces. They did not sit. They did not complain. They simply stood and waited for the next instruction. Phase 2, Grant said. The humans paired off and began sparring. I leaned forward in my seat. This was what I had been waiting for. I had seen their physical conditioning and acknowledged that it was thorough, even impressive in its systematic intensity. But conditioning was not fighting. Speed and endurance were nothing without technique. Within the first 30 seconds, I understood why Grant had smiled at the opening ceremony. The humans did not fight in one style. They did not even fight in 2 or 3. Each sparring pair cycled through technique after technique, striking, flowing into grappling, flowing into joint manipulation, flowing into throws, flowing into groundwork, flowing into standing strikes again. The transitions were so fluid that it was impossible to tell where one system ended and another began. It was as if each human contained an entire library of combat methods and could access any volume at any moment. But that was not the part that froze the gallery in their seats. The sequence began with a sidestep, continued into a wrist lock, and finished with a sweeping throw that put her partner flat on the ground. I recognized the sidestep. It was a modified version of a Nathari evasion pattern, the exact diagonal retreat used in the second movement of the blade dance. I recognized the wrist lock. It was adapted from Caliph grappling, the same joint isolation technique my species had used for centuries, but adjusted for the different leverage points of the human skeletal structure. And the throw was something else entirely, something I had never seen before, something that used the opponent's own momentum as the primary force. She had taken pieces from our fighting styles and built something new. She had seen it too. The humans had not just watched their demonstrations politely over the past 3 days. They had analyzed them, deconstructed them, identified the underlying principles, and begun integrating those principles into their own combat training. In 3 days, a murmur spread through the gallery. I heard it move from section to section. A low vibration of voices in a dozen different languages, all saying variations of the same thing. Did you see that? Did you see what she did? That was our technique. That was our movement. They took it. They changed it. Grant let the sparring continue for another 20 minutes, and with each minute, the gallery grew more silent. The humans demonstrated counters to Gorvan rushing attacks, using angular footwork to redirect the momentum of a larger opponent into the floor. They showed responses to Silith-style flanking patterns, keeping their backs to each other in rotating pairs so that no approach angle was left unguarded. They practiced techniques I could not identify at all, methods that seemed designed for fighting in zero gravity, in narrow spaces, in water, against multiple opponents simultaneously. They were not masters of any single style. but they were dangerously competent in all of them. And more importantly, they were not trying to be better at Kalith fighting than the Kalith, or better at Nathari blade work than the Nathari. They were taking the best elements from every style they encountered and forging them into something that belonged to no tradition and answered to no rules. Grant called a halt, and the sparring stopped. The soldiers stood in their loose formation, breathing steadily, many of them bleeding from minor cuts and impacts sustained during the full contact exchanges. Not one of them had called for medical attention or acknowledged their injuries in any way. Phase 3, Grant said. The third phase was where I began to feel truly afraid. Not for myself. A Kalith does not fear for himself. But afraid for the certainty I had carried for 200 years, the absolute conviction that my species understood combat better than any other in the galaxy. That certainty had been the foundation of everything I was, and I could feel it cracking beneath me like ice over deep water. The humans set up what Grant called stress inoculation training. 8 soldiers entered the simulated structure in the center of the arena. The moment they crossed the threshold, controlled chaos erupted around them. Flash charges detonated in the walls, filling the space with blinding light and deafening sound. Smoke poured from vents in the floor, reducing visibility to near zero. Speakers mounted in the ceiling blasted a cacophony of overlapping noises, shouted commands and warning alarms, and weapon discharges, all at volumes that I could feel vibrating in my chest even from the gallery. The soldiers inside the structure were also being subjected to physical discomfort. I could see from the monitoring feeds that mild electric pulses were being applied through their uniform contacts, enough to cause involuntary muscle spasms, not enough to cause real injury. It was controlled, calibrated, and precisely targeted to be as disorienting as possible without doing permanent damage. And while all of this was happening, while their senses were under coordinated assault and their bodies were fighting involuntary responses, the soldiers were required to perform tasks. One soldier navigated through the smoke-filled structure using only verbal commands from a partner outside who was reading a map. Another field-stripped a weapon, reassembled it, and verified its function while flash charges went off inches from her face. A third administered simulated medical treatment to a training dummy, following a complex protocol that required precise measurements and timing, while the floor beneath her shook and sparked. They were training their minds to ignore what their bodies were screaming at them. Every natural instinct, every survival reflex, every automatic flinch and panic response that their nervous systems were producing, they were learning to acknowledge, set aside, and continue working. No other species in the galaxy trained this way. I knew this with absolute certainty, because I had studied every combat tradition in known space. The Kalith achieved clarity through the silence, the purging of emotion. The Gorvon achieved endurance through pain conditioning, the numbing of sensation. The Silith achieved dominance through psychic superiority, the avoidance of physical engagement entirely. The humans did something different from all of them. They did not purge fear. They did not numb pain. They did not avoid chaos. They walked straight into the worst conditions their trainers could create, and they forced themselves to function anyway. They kept the fear and worked through it. They felt the pain and solved problems despite it. They accepted that conditions would be terrible, that nothing would go according to plan, that their own bodies would betray them with panic and confusion and agony, and they trained specifically and relentlessly to perform at a high level under exactly those circumstances. I looked around the gallery and saw something I had never seen in 200 years of conclaves. Every face, every expression, every body posture in every delegation told the same story. The Gorvon had stopped moving entirely. Druk stood like a statue carved from stone, his massive jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the arena with an intensity that had nothing to do with amusement, and everything to do with the dawning recognition of something he had never considered possible. The Nathari delegation leader had lowered all 4 arms to her sides, and her mandibles were pressed tightly together, the Nathari equivalent of stunned silence. The Silith had pulled back their psychic feelers entirely, as if they had reached out to probe the human minds and encountered something that made them recoil. The galaxy's mightiest fighters were afraid, not of human strength or speed or weapons. They were afraid because humans had just revealed an entirely different approach to combat. one that none of them had imagined, and none of them were prepared for. Every species in this station trained for the best-case version of a fight. The humans trained for the worst case. Every species built their warriors to be the perfected form of their natural abilities. The humans built their warriors to survive and function when every natural ability had been taken away. Grant called a halt to the stress exercises and moved immediately to the final phase. Applied tactics, she said. 5 soldiers entered the simulated structure again, this time configured as a multi-room clearing exercise. Their objective was to move through the structure, neutralize simulated threats, and extract a simulated casualty. Simple enough. Except the rules changed. Every 30 seconds, a new variable was introduced. The lights went out. Gravity shifted as the floor plates adjusted. One soldier's weapon was remotely disabled, simulating a jam. Another soldier was designated as wounded, their left arm strapped to their body so they could only use one hand. Communication channels were cut, restored, cut again. Walls moved, reconfiguring the floor plan in real time. The 5 soldiers adapted to each change without hesitation, without confusion, without any visible moment of uncertainty. When the lights died, they switched to verbal coordination, calling out positions and movements in clipped phrases that contained maximum information in minimum words. When a weapon failed, the disarmed soldier shifted role instantly, becoming the point navigator while another soldier covered their firing sector. When a teammate was designated wounded, 2 others adjusted their formation to protect the casualty, while the wounded soldier took over communications with one hand. The most remarkable moment came near the end. 2 soldiers were simultaneously designated as casualties, leaving only 3 functional operators in a dark, shifting structure with active simulated threats. One picked up a wounded teammate and carried them on his back while clearing rooms with his weapon held in one hand. Another used a disabled weapon as a splint for the second casualty's leg, fashioning it with strips torn from his own uniform, and then took the casualty's functional weapon and continued the exercise. The third soldier covered them both, moving backwards through the structure, providing rear security while calling out directions to the carrier. They saw the problem, evaluated the resources available, discarded the plan that no longer worked, built a new plan from whatever they had, and executed it immediately. The gallery was silent, not the bored silence of a disengaged audience, not the confused silence of spectators who did not understand what they were watching. This was the silence of warriors who had spent their entire lives believing they understood the nature of combat, and were now realizing, all at once, that they had been looking at only a small piece of a much larger picture. The 5 soldiers completed the exercise, carried their simulated casualties to the extraction point, and reported the structure clear. Commander Grant turned to face the gallery. She stood at the center of the arena floor, this small, scarred woman surrounded by her 30 soldiers, and she looked up at the assembled might of the galaxy with the same calm expression she had worn since the moment she stepped off her transport. "That concludes our demonstration," she said. "What you observed is a standard training rotation. My soldiers run a version of this 4 days a week." She paused, and in the silence of the gallery, her next words fell like stones dropped into deep water. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The silence stretched until it became physical, a weight pressing down on every being in that room. My scales had risen along my spine, an involuntary threat response that I had not experienced since my first combat encounter over a century ago. I looked at the faces around me, and saw my own shock reflected in every one of them. The Gorvon champion who had laughed at the humans and called them prey. The Nathari who had dismissed them as physically insignificant. The Silith who had radiated contempt from behind their sealed screens. All of them were staring at the arena floor with the same expression, and it was an expression that none of them would ever willingly admit to wearing. It was the expression of someone who has been certain of their place in the world and has just discovered that the world is far larger than they imagined. My mind was racing through implications, connections, tactical projections, and every path led to the same conclusion. We had been measuring ourselves against each other for 900 years, comparing claw to blade, to mind to fist, and we had all been playing the same game with different pieces. The humans were not playing our game at all. They were playing something else entirely, a game where the rules changed every 30 seconds, and the only winning strategy was the ability to invent new strategies faster than the situation could deteriorate. For the first time in 9 centuries, the galaxy's mightiest fighters had nothing to say. The conclave erupted within the hour. Not in public. The gallery dispersed in that heavy silence, each delegation retreating to their quarters with the careful composure of species that knew they were being watched. But behind closed doors, the station's communication channels lit up with encrypted traffic. Private meetings were called. Alliances that had been stable for decades were suddenly renegotiated, and somewhere in the upper administrative levels, a coalition began to form. I knew this because I could smell it. Calith olfactory senses are extraordinarily precise. We can detect chemical signatures across biological barriers, through ventilation systems, across significant distances. So does anger, and so does the particular blend of both that surfaces when powerful beings feel their position threatened. They want the humans disqualified from the exhibition phase. The Gorvan, whose training included having their young warriors beaten with metal rods until they stopped flinching, were claiming that human push-ups and smoke exercises constituted self-harm. The absurdity was so transparent that it would have been amusing if the underlying motivation were not so serious. Who else is joining them? I asked. The Silith are considering a parallel objection. They want to classify the stress adaptation phase as psychological coercion, which would fall under the Conclave's prohibition on mind-affecting techniques. The Silith, who project raw fear into their opponents' nervous systems. Yes. And the Nathari? Thelis hesitated. The Nathari are not joining the formal objection, but their delegation leader has filed a private request for additional security in the observation gallery during any future human demonstrations. She cited concerns about unpredictable combatant behavior. So the Nathari were not brave enough to attack the humans directly, but wanted armed guards between themselves and the species that had reverse-engineered their blade dance in 3 days. That told me everything about where their confidence stood. He was a fine warrior, direct and dependable. He did not deal well with situations that fell outside established patterns. We should join the coalition, he said. Not because the humans violated any rules. They did not. But because our position depends on perception as much as skill. If the humans are allowed to compete in exhibitions, and they perform even half as well as their training suggests they might, the perception of Calith supremacy will suffer. We do not need to fight them if we can prevent them from fighting at all. It was sound political reasoning. It was also cowardice, and I told him so. He flinched, which meant he agreed with me, but did not want to. The Caliph have held our rank for 900 years through combat excellence, not committee votes. If we cannot hold it against humans on the arena floor, then we do not deserve to hold it at all. Thelis started to argue. Supreme Champion versus humanity's chosen representative. Exhibition rules, full contact, no weapons. I will settle this the way it should be settled. Thelis stared at me for a long moment. Then he bowed his head and left. Ill Commander Grant's response came back in 4 minutes. She accepted without conditions or counter-proposals. Her only addition was the name of the human fighter she had selected. Sergeant Daniel Webb. When Thelis brought me the name, I pulled up Webb's file and studied it. He was not the most physically imposing human in the delegation. He was not the fastest or the most heavily decorated. He held the rank of sergeant, which placed him in the middle tier of their military hierarchy. Experienced enough to be trusted with responsibility, but not senior enough to be considered exceptional. He was, by every metric available to me, an average representative of an average species. Grant had chosen him deliberately. The message was unmistakable. She was not sending her best. She was not sending her biggest or strongest or most skilled. She was sending a competent mid-level soldier, because she was telling the galaxy that a competent mid-level human was enough. The selection itself was a weapon, and it was aimed directly at 900 years of carefully constructed Caliph superiority. I spent the next 2 days preparing. Meditation, combat drills. I noted his tendencies, his favorite angles, his recovery speed between exchanges. What I found disturbed me. Against taller sparring partners, Webb lowered his center of gravity and worked from underneath, using leverage and angular momentum to negate reach advantages. Against faster partners, he slowed the pace, controlling distance, forcing exchanges at a rhythm that favored endurance over speed. Against heavier partners, he gave ground deliberately, redirecting force rather than meeting it, letting his opponent's mass work against them. He did not have one fighting style. He had a system for selecting the right style based on the specific problem standing in front of him. It was not memorized. It was not rehearsed. He made decisions in real time, evaluated the situation, accessed his library of techniques, chose the appropriate response, and executed it before the moment passed. I had never fought anyone like this. In 214 bouts against the finest fighters in the galaxy, every opponent had come at me with their best technique, the thing they were most skilled at. And I had defeated them because the silence gave me the clarity to find the gaps in any single approach. But Webb did not commit to a single approach. He would change mid-exchange if his initial choice proved less effective than expected. Fighting him would be like fighting water. Every time I closed my fist, he would flow through my fingers. The night before the bout, I could not settle my mind. The silence kept slipping away from me like a smooth stone I could not grip. I paced my quarters, running through scenarios, and every scenario ended the same way. Not with my defeat necessarily, but with uncertainty. For the first time in my career, I genuinely did not know what would happen when I stepped onto the arena floor, and that uncertainty was more unsettling than any opponent I had ever faced. In the early hours of the morning, I made a decision that broke every protocol I had established for myself. Over 2 centuries of competition, I left my quarters and walked to the lower ring. The human section was quiet. Most of the soldiers were asleep. But as I rounded the corner toward the common area, I found Webb sitting alone at a small table under a dim overhead light. He had a book in one hand, an actual physical book made of paper, and in the other hand he held a jar. He was eating from the jar with his fingers, scooping out a thick brown paste and licking it clean between turning pages. He looked up when I entered, and showed no surprise at finding a 7-foot Kalith champion standing in his doorway in the middle of the night. "Supreme Champion," he said. "Peanut butter?" He held out the jar. I stared at the jar. "What is it?" "Ground nuts mixed with oil and salt. It is better than it looks." He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit down if you want." I was not sleeping anyway. I sat. The chair was too small for me, but I managed. He pushed the jar across the table, and I dipped one claw into the paste and tasted it. It was dense, sticky, intensely flavored. Not unpleasant. "You are reading," I said. "The night before a combat exhibition against the highest-ranked fighter in the galaxy." "Yes." "You are not drilling. You are not meditating. You are not studying my techniques." He shrugged. "I studied your techniques yesterday. And the day before that. More study now will not help. Either I have prepared enough or I have not. Worrying about it at this point would just make me tired." He took another scoop of peanut butter. "Besides, this is a good book." I did not know what to do with this. In Kalith warrior culture, the night before a significant bout was sacred. He looked at me, and his expression shifted slightly. Not defensive, honest. "Of course I am afraid," he said. "You are bigger than me, faster than me, stronger than me, and you have been doing this for longer than my entire species has been in space. I would be an idiot not to be afraid." I was stunned, not by the admission itself, but by the ease of it. In Kalith culture, admitting fear was the deepest possible shame. A warrior who acknowledged fear was confessing that their training had failed, that the silence had not purged them completely, that they were still contaminated by weakness. A warrior who admitted fear before a bout would be removed from competition and sent back for retraining. He put his book down and gave the question genuine thought, which I appreciated. "Fear keeps you honest," he said finally. "It tells you what you have not prepared for yet. If I were not afraid of you, it would mean I was either lying to myself or too stupid to recognize how dangerous you are. Neither of those would help me tomorrow." He paused. "The goal is not to be fearless. The goal is to be afraid and do the job anyway." "In my culture," I said slowly, "fear is a thing to be destroyed." Webb nodded. "In mine, it is a tool. Like anything else, you can let it control you, or you can put it to work." I stood up from the too small chair. My joints protested. "Tomorrow will be interesting," I said. "Yes," Webb agreed. "It will." He picked up his book again. "Good night, Supreme Champion." "Good night, Sergeant." I walked back to my quarters through the silent corridors of the Crucible and did not attempt the silence again. Instead, I lay on my sleeping platform and thought about fear as a tool, about reading books while the galaxy watched, about a species that did not try to eliminate weakness but instead learned how to carry it and keep moving. The bout was scheduled for midday. The arena was configured for standard exhibition rules, which meant a flat circular platform, 12 meters in diameter, with no weapons, no environmental modifiers, and no time limit. The fight continued until one combatant submitted, was rendered unable to continue, or was pushed from the ring. The stands filled rapidly. Every seat was taken within the first hour. Overflow crowds watched on screens throughout the station. I entered the arena from the eastern gate. The crowd noise hit me like a physical force. A wall of sound made up of roars and clicks and hisses, and psychic hums from a dozen different species. I wore the traditional Kalith competition garments, minimal wrappings that left my scales and claws exposed. My body was ready. My mind was clear. Not the silence. Not exactly. Something else. Something that allowed room for the uncertainty I had been fighting all week. The western gate opened, and Daniel Webb walked out. He was 5 feet 10 inches tall. He weighed perhaps 190 pounds. He had no claws, no armor, no venom, no psychic ability, no natural weapon of any kind. He was wearing a plain gray training uniform and standard-issue boots. He stepped onto the platform, bounced on his toes a few times, rolled his neck from side to side, and grinned at me. The Conclave Master raised his hand between us. Exhibition bout. Supreme Champion Vorkon Drellis of the Kalith Dominion versus Sergeant Daniel Webb of the Human Coalition. Standard rules. Begin on signal. He dropped his hand. I moved first. 900 years of Kalith combat tradition said that the superior fighter opens the engagement. You demonstrate dominance immediately. You show the opponent and the audience that the outcome is already decided. You move with such speed and precision that by the time the opponent's brain has processed what is happening, the fight is already in its final stages. It was fast, precise, and carried enough force behind it to crack a Gorvon's bone plate. Webb was not there. He had moved at the exact moment I committed to the strike, sliding to my left with a half-step that was so economical it barely registered as movement. My claw passed through empty air, and before I could retract and reset, he was inside my reach, closer than any opponent had voluntarily positioned themselves in decades. He hit me twice, once in the nerve cluster beneath my left arm, once in the soft tissue between the scales on my lower ribs. The strikes were not powerful by Kalith standards. A Gorvon would have barely felt them. But they were placed with surgical precision on the 2 points of my body, where the natural armor was thinnest, and the impact sent electric jolts of discomfort, radiating outward through my torso. I swept my tail in a low arc meant to take his legs. He jumped over it, which I expected, and I was already rotating to catch him in the air with my follow-up claw strike. But he did not jump straight up. He jumped forward, toward me, closing distance when every instinct said he should have been creating it. He caught my striking arm at the wrist, used my own momentum to redirect himself around my body, and landed behind me with his feet already set. The crowd noise changed. It had been roaring. Now it faltered, the way sound falters when a large number of beings all hold their breath at the same time. I turned and faced him. He was breathing slightly harder than before, and his expression had shifted from that easy grin to something more focused. He had felt the speed of my initial attack, and he was adjusting. I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes in real time, processing data, updating his model of my capabilities, recalibrating his approach. Claw, elbow, tail, each one targeting a different height and angle, each one designed to herd the opponent into the path of the next. Webb blocked the first strike with a forearm technique that absorbed the impact through his entire body, rather than meeting it with rigid resistance. He redirected the second by twisting at the waist, letting my elbow pass over his shoulder so close that it grazed his uniform. The third, the tail sweep, caught him across the hip and sent him stumbling sideways. First clean hit. The gallery erupted. Druck roared his approval. The Nathari clicked rapidly. My own delegation pounded the railing. Webb caught his balance, touched his hip where the tail had connected, and nodded slightly. Not a nod of pain or defeat, a nod of acknowledgement. He had felt my power, registered it, filed it away. And I saw his stance shift subtly, his weight distribution changing by a fraction, his feet angling slightly wider. He was adjusting for the tail. He would not be caught by that angle again. We circled each other. The crowd quieted, sensing the shift in the bout's energy. This was no longer a demonstration of dominance. This was a conversation between two fighters who were beginning to understand each other. Webb attacked. His approach was nothing like mine. Where I moved in straight lines with maximum force, he moved in curves, angles, constantly shifting the direction of his pressure. He feinted low and struck high. He feinted high and shot in low, driving for my legs with a speed that caught me off guard. I sprawled backward, preventing the takedown, but he had already transitioned to a different technique, coming up from underneath with an elbow strike, aimed at the underside of my jaw. I caught the elbow with my palm and shoved him back. The force of my push sent him sliding 3 meters across the platform. He turned the slide into a controlled roll, came up on his feet, and was moving again before I could press the advantage. And then something happened that I did not expect. He changed. Not physically, but the way he moved, the rhythm of his footwork, the timing of his attacks, all of it shifted in the space of a single heartbeat. He had been fighting with a boxing-influenced style for the first 2 exchanges, keeping distance, working with straight punches and angular footwork. Now he dropped lower, widened his base, and began moving with the flowing circular patterns of something I had never seen before. His hands were open, not closed, and they moved in sweeping arcs that redirected my strikes rather than blocking them. He was cycling through his styles. Not randomly, but strategically, selecting the approach that best countered what I had shown him so far. He had spent the first 2 exchanges gathering information. Now he was using it. I pushed forward with a rapid series of claw strikes, testing his new approach. He redirected the first 3 with those circular hand movements, each redirection smooth and effortless, turning my force aside without absorbing it. On the 4th strike, he caught my wrist, stepped in close, and applied pressure to a joint angle that my species was not supposed to be vulnerable at. Pain flared through my forearm, sharp and immediate. He had found a weakness in Calith physiology that no species had exploited in 900 years of competitive combat. A joint angle between the radius and ulna equivalents of my forearm, a structural gap so minor that it had never appeared in any anatomical study I was aware of. He had found it in 3 exchanges. I tore my arm free with raw strength, the kind of explosive power that the human body could not match, and drove forward with my shoulder. The impact caught him square in the chest and launched him backward. He hit the platform hard, rolled, and came up gasping. That one hurt. But he was still standing. The fight continued. Minutes stretched into something unmeasurable. I stopped counting exchanges. I stopped analyzing technique. Something had shifted in me, something fundamental, and I realized with a shock of clarity that the silence was gone. Not because I had lost control, but because I had abandoned it. The silence was a cage. I understood that now, standing on this platform with sweat running down my scales and my lungs burning with effort. The silence gave me clarity by cutting away everything else, every emotion, every instinct, every creative impulse that might have led to an unexpected solution. He took risks that a perfect fighter would never take, and sometimes those risks paid off in ways that no amount of calculation could have predicted. He was not fighting me with the precision of a machine. He was fighting me with the chaotic, adaptive, relentless creativity of a living mind that refused to be constrained by any single definition of what a fighter should be. And in that moment, standing across from this small, soft-skinned, clawless, armorless, venomless creature who had no business surviving the first 10 seconds of a bout with me, I did something that I had not done in 200 years. I improvised. I abandoned the Calith guard. I dropped the formal stance, the textbook footwork, the calculated strike patterns. I reached past the silence, into the part of my mind that I had been trained since hatching to suppress. The part that felt, that imagined, that guessed and hoped and feared. I combined techniques that were never meant to be combined. I threw strikes from angles that violated every principle I had been taught. Webb saw the change immediately. His eyes widened for a fraction of a second, surprise and recognition together, and then he was adapting again, his own style shifting to meet this new version of me that neither of us had known existed 5 minutes ago. The last phase of the fight was unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. Two fighters, evolving in real time, each one pushing the other past the boundaries of their training, past the limits of their traditions, into territory that no warrior from either species had ever explored. The crowd had gone silent again, but this silence was different from the one that had followed the human training demonstration. That had been shock. This was reverence. Even the most arrogant warriors in the gallery understood that they were watching something historic. The end came, not with a dramatic finish, but with a quiet truth. After 40 minutes of sustained combat, the most physically and mentally demanding 40 minutes of my entire career, we both reached our limits at the same moment. My legs gave out first, a failure of the fast-twitch muscle fibers in my calves that I had never experienced before. I dropped to one knee. Across from me, Webb staggered, caught himself, staggered again, and went down to both knees. We knelt on the platform facing each other, 3 meters apart, both of us bleeding from dozens of minor wounds, both of us breathing in ragged gasps that echoed through the silent arena. Webb looked at me through swollen eyes and did something that broke me open in a way that no strike had managed. He laughed. Not a bitter laugh. Not a mocking laugh. A genuine, exhausted, delighted laugh, the sound of someone who has pushed himself to the absolute edge of his capabilities and found the experience magnificent. The Conclave Master ruled the bout a draw. Technically, neither fighter had been rendered unable to continue, and neither had submitted or been pushed from the ring. We had simply reached a point where continuing would have caused permanent damage, and the medical teams intervened. The ruling was irrelevant. Everyone in that arena knew what had happened. The galaxy's undefeated supreme champion, the finest warrior produced by 900 years of Kalith combat tradition, had been pushed to absolute exhaustion by a mid-ranked human soldier who had been eating paste from a jar an hour before the fight. The aftermath unfolded quickly. The coalition to disqualify the humans dissolved overnight. Nobody was willing to put their name on a document arguing that the species who had just fought the supreme champion to a draw was not qualified for competition. The political calculations shifted like sand in a current, alliances reforming, hierarchies being quietly reassessed. But something larger was happening too, something that went beyond politics and rankings. The Nathari wanted to understand how humans cross-trained between styles. The Gorvan asked about human endurance conditioning methods. Even the Silith, who never voluntarily interacted with physical combat species, requested information about the stress inoculation techniques. The humans responded to every inquiry with complete openness. They shared their training manuals, they demonstrated techniques, they sparred with any species that asked, adjusting their approach each time to account for different physiologies and fighting traditions. They held nothing back, and when I asked Grant why, she looked at me with that patient expression and said something I will never forget. Hoarding knowledge does not make you stronger. It just makes everyone else weaker. And weak opponents teach you nothing. On the final day of the conclave, the delegations gathered for the traditional vote. For 9 centuries, the vote had been a formality, a rubber stamp confirming Caliph supremacy that everyone had already accepted. This time, there was genuine uncertainty in the chamber. I could smell it, sharp and electric, on every species present. The conclave master called for nominations for the title of Supreme Champion Species. Druk stood and, to the surprise of everyone, did not nominate the Gorvan. He nominated the humans. They have earned it, he said simply, and sat back down with the finality of a mountain settling. Several delegations murmured in agreement. The Nathari leader rose to second the nomination. The momentum was building towards something that would have been unthinkable a week ago. Then I stood up. The chamber went quiet. Every eye turned to me. I was the supreme champion. The voice that carried more weight in this room than any other. Whatever I said next would determine the outcome of the vote and the direction of galactic combat culture for the next decade. I withdraw the Caliph from the ranking, I said. Thelis made a sound beside me that was halfway between a gasp and a growl. I heard similar reactions throughout my delegation. 900 years of tradition, 9 centuries of unbroken dominance, and I was walking away from it voluntarily. Furthermore, I continued, I propose that the ranking system itself be abolished. The silence in the chamber became absolute. I could hear, far away, the deep resonant pulse of the Crucible's orbital engines. For 900 years, we have measured ourselves against each other, I said. We have crowned champions, and ranked species, and built our identities around the question of who is mightiest. We have all trained to be the best version of what we already are, and we have competed to prove that our version is superior. I looked at the human delegation. Grant was watching me with an expression I could not read. Webb stood beside her, a bruise darkening the left side of his face, his right hand wrapped in a medical brace. He gave me a slight nod. The humans have shown us something different, I continued. They have shown us that the measure of a warrior is not how perfectly you execute your tradition. It is how quickly you can change when your tradition is not enough. They have shown us that strength is not a fixed quantity to be measured and ranked. It is a living thing that grows only when it is challenged, only when it is forced to adapt, only when it meets something it has never encountered before, and refuses to stop. I paused and looked around the chamber, the assembled warriors, the strongest, fastest, most disciplined, most psychically gifted fighters in the known galaxy. Because it is only by training together, learning from each other, challenging each other, that any of us will reach the potential that we have not even begun to explore. The vote was unanimous. For the first time in the history of the decennial combat conclave, no supreme champion species was crowned. In its place, a new tradition was born, one of collaborative training, shared knowledge, and mutual challenge. It would take years to fully implement. It would face resistance and setbacks, and the stubborn pride of species that had built their cultures around being the best. But it began that day, in that chamber, with a vote that every warrior present knew was right. After the ceremony, I found myself in the medical bay, seated on an examination table, while a pylori medic applied regenerative gel to the cuts and bruises I had accumulated during the bout. Webb was on the table next to me, undergoing similar treatment from a human medic. "So," he said, "that was a thing." "Yes," I agreed, "that was a thing." He reached into his uniform pocket and produced, somehow, the jar of peanut butter. It was nearly empty. He held it out to me. I took it and scooped out a claw's worth of the thick brown paste. It tasted the same as it had the night before, dense and salty and oddly satisfying. I handed the jar back. "How did your species become what you are?" I asked him. He thought about it while chewing. "Honestly, we are not the strongest. We are not the fastest. We are not the toughest. We have never been any of those things, not compared to half the predators on our own planet, let alone the rest of the galaxy." He screwed the lid back on the empty jar and set it on the table between us. That is all we are. We had been so busy being the mightiest that we had forgotten to ask whether mightiest was the right thing to be. We had perfected ourselves into a fixed shape, beautiful and powerful and completely unable to become anything else. The humans had never stopped changing. They had never stopped growing. They had never once looked at themselves and said, "This is enough. This is the final version. This is what we are forever." That was their power. Not strength, not speed, not endurance, not technique. The absolute, stubborn, unshakable insistence that whatever they were today, they could be something more tomorrow.